Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on emerging doctrine and the Army's vision of warfare. Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this podcast topic is ATP 3-72, Writing Team Talks, which is focusing on ATP 372, Operations in a Nuclear Environment. We welcome doctrine authors Lieutenant Colonel Jason Wood and Lieutenant Colonel Shaun Young. They're coming to us from the U.S. Army Nuclear and Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction Agency, USANCA. They are Functional Area 52 officers, experts in nuclear weapons, nuclear effects, strategic nuclear deterrence, and counter weapons of mass destruction. Welcome to the show. So how did you both get interested in a career focused on nuclear operations?
So I was a 74 Alpha before. That was a CBRN officer, and throughout my career there was lots of exposure to being a staff advisor, so advising those staffs as the commanders on counter weapons of mass destruction. I transitioned over to Functional Area 52 a little bit late, so I'd been a battalion executive officer in an S3 and really focused on the tactical and operational level. Throughout my career, I spent lots of time in Korea, so lots of exposure to CBRN, counter weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear challenges. So as I evaluated my career, I looked at myself and said, hey, I can probably serve better perhaps at the strategic level and try to overcome some of these challenges that I'm seeing. Before I arrived to USANCA, I came from Korea as a protection chief. And there's some wicked challenges that, it doesn't seem to be going away very quickly. But currently I work as a branch chief for the nuclear employment augmentation teams. So nuclear operations is a big part of what I enjoy. And it's my current duties right now. Jason?
Yeah, thanks. So I started as an engineer officer. Like Shaun, I finished out my KD time in a training battalion. So he was operational. I was training combat engineers and bridge crew members. And I was medically non-deployable, so I looked for other ways to serve in the Army. And, I've always been interested in nuclear weapons and in the science of them. And getting an advanced technical degree has always been a bucket list item of mine. So when I saw Functional Area 52 come up, I decided to join. So that was back in 2018.
Thanks. I want to start our conversation by talking about a previous episode that we had, also about nuclear operations. So we talked to Major General Retired Garricky on the show, and I asked him about chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear operations, or CBRN. And I asked if we were doing a disservice to each of these operations by combining them together, so lumping together CBRN. And here's what he said.
Chem, bio, and nuclear are different. They are distinct. They have a relationship in terms they are different than conventional munitions. They are the same in that way, but they are absolutely unique in their characteristics, how they're employed, and the consequences of their use.
So from your standpoint as nuclear operation practitioners, what are the pros and cons to using the CBRN nomenclature?
Yeah, Lisa, you're absolutely right on the distinction, and there's definitely both good and bad associated with roping it together like that. Grossly simplified, most soldiers think of it as a battle drill when you think of CBRN. Get your shot or take your mitigation measures, put on a mask and run away. But it's really a bit more than that. It's about looking at the operating environment. And, again, I'll simplify that it's looking at it as like a wet weather conditions. We wear a poncho when we go outside when it's raining. But we learn to fight and survive, fight, and win in that battlefield. So we've got to look at CBRN much in the same way. As I see it, the pros of that, of looking at it as an operating environment, there's certainly similarities in simplifying, battle drills and making it palatable to commanders and staffs of hey, if I train for a CBRN operating environment, I'm also training perhaps for a biological and a radiological nuclear environment. There's similar protection concepts as you relate to that, and risk mitigation and erring on the side of caution. And obviously, there's a little bit of differences between the two, but overall, that's definitely one of the pros. Also, when we look at this, it's very tactically focused when we rope them together. Kind of right of boom responsiveness, threat focused, and it's being reactive, as we get after those battle drills. And though there are some pros to that, there's definitely some cons. And so there's some dangers of looking at each one of those, the C, the B, the R, and the N, the same, and not respecting the differences. As we look at nuclear specifically, one thing that we forget about nuclear weapons is that, these are tools that we have in our kit bag that we may be using against the enemy. And so as we look at it, whereas CBR and rope together is perhaps looking at a ride of boom and threat focused, the danger is that we look at them, if we don't look at them separately, we forget that we have blue planning activities that we can perhaps have opportunities at, and looking at it left of boom to be able to, exploit and make the best use of the effects on the battlefield. And so we lose a little bit of that when we rope them together. And obviously, I talked a little bit about, CBR lump together really looks at the tactical focus. Separating those out allows us to look at the planning from the operational and strategic impacts of those operating environments. I would preface that and say, during the Cold War, the Army really excelled at integrating nuclear operations into planning. The Army overall had nuclear artillery and air defense artillery, but we've moved away from that and kind of divested ourselves of those capabilities. Rightfully so. We had a different threat environment with violent extremists in the counterinsurgency that we were fighting during the time. But we've moved away from that, and much of our expertise in that area of planning at the operational and tactical level has perhaps atrophied. One of our regulations that we used to have is the Field Manual 100-30, and was nuclear operations. That manual was made 25 years ago, and that was pre counterinsurgency focus. And again, we've atrophied. So when we look at ATP 3-72 operations in a nuclear environment, this is our doctrine to really get after this and helps overcome some of these challenges, and really delineates both the tactical level, but also the operational strategic level of how we plan these operations. Jason, did you have anything to add?
No, I think you nailed it.
So I mentioned in the intro that you both are assigned to, it's a mouthful, United States Army Nuclear and Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction Agency, or USANCA. So could you tell the listeners about this organization, what you do, maybe what connections that you have with the Seaburn School at Fort Leonard Wood?
Yeah, absolutely. So the U.S. Army Nuclear and Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction Agency, our mission is really to increase lethality and survivability by providing nuclear counter weapons of mass destruction expertise to shape strategic guidance, policy plans, and integrate into the joint forces and theater headquarters to get after the conventional nuclear integration. And really what that, the short, simplified version of that is operating in, around, and through a nuclear environment, supporting the employment and planning the employment of nuclear objectives in order for our joint force and the Army to be able to survive, fight, and win in a nuclear environment. And really one of our big efforts is within the Army Campaign Plan, and that's Campaign Plan Objective 10 Bravo. The U.S. Army Nuclear and Counter Weapons of Mass Destruction Agency has been leading an effort to really work after that. And this is really as we transition the Army to look at large-scale combat operations and the impacts of what that looks like as we transition from counterinsurgency to really going back to large-scale combat operations based on the threat environment. Overall, we're not a TRADOC organization, but we're a field operating agency under Headquarters Department of the Army, G357. And our nuclear expertise, it does extend to TRADOC and the U.S. Army Seaburn School, especially when it relates to doctrine. We work with them extensively in getting nuclear concerns across all Army doctrine, not just ATP 3-72. And so we work with them quite regularly. I alluded to it a bit in the left of boom and blue planning, but that's really, an oversimplification of what USANCA works to shape in doctrine, specifically in 372. And as we look at like the U.S. Army Seaburn School, they're really focused on consequence management and hazard mitigation when it relates to nuclear operations. So we both obviously work with Combined Arms Center and driving the operating environment. So that's working to develop the decisive action training environment to be able to shape the way that we train, not just the doctrine, but those combat training centers where we can work on the doctrine. Those warfighter exercises where we can look at opportunities on how staffs and commanders are planning and conducting operations, and really get after determining, hey, look, counterinsurgency is gone away now. So we have this large-scale operations, and we really need to understand it and the differences, and then have those metrics to be able to look at, have we overcome the challenges associated with it and been able to train for that? We really look at we can prepare and train for the fight that we want to have in a large-scale combat operation, or we can look for the fight that's in front of us. And so there's a lot of change that we need to work through, and we see that in the Army Campaign Plan, Objective 10 Bravo, but we also see that in the future of the Army in the 2030 and the 2040 fight.
Could you give us the big idea of campaign plan or campaign objective 10 Bravo?
Yeah, so overall, Campaign Plan Objective 10 Bravo really seeks to look at the opportunities and the challenges associated with our new threat environment. Of how do we look at our acute threat in Russia and our pacing threat in China, and how do we structure and change the Army to be able to overcome those threats. And there's a lot of opportunities to look at, and different milestones that we can achieve as an Army to be able to increase our lethality, and also just increase our survivability. With again the ultimate goal of being able to survive, fight, and win, not just in a nuclear environment, but all of the operating environments that those threats would present to us.
And you mentioned 2030, 2040. So are you also working with Army Futures Command?
That's right. We definitely work with Army Futures Command, Developmental Command, and agencies across the Army, and we really leverage the Army in general of getting after nuclear operations and getting after that nuclear expertise that our organization can provide. So all of the equities of, is it a new piece of equipment? Is it a new doctrine that needs to be developed? Is it training that needs to be developed? So as we look at the .mil-PF spectrum, USANC is really the organization for the Army that gets after the analysis as it relates to counter weapons of mass destruction and nuclear operations.
So you're really the SMEs then, when it comes to nuclear operations.
Absolutely. What I would say is that we're a small organization, and we depend very, very highly on the functional area 52s that are also across the force in those staffs to give us the latest and greatest of what are the capabilities, what are the challenges, and what are we seeing the latest and greatest in the plans across our force. So I would say that yes, USANC is from a planning policy and getting after .mil-PF capability-based assessments across the Army, absolutely. But all of our theaters and combatant commands, they have functional area 52s and nuclear subject matter expertise that perhaps are a little bit more regionally aligned than our headquarters is. But we definitely, can provide that nuclear expertise and draw expertise from those outside formations in.
Thanks for the rundown. Okay, we got to get to the doctrine though. So ATP 372. Jason, you were the lead editor for the March 2022 version of this publication. Were there any big changes or were there considerations when you were developing the pub? And also, I'd like you to talk about ATP 372 as it is a multi-service publication. So if there were any sticking points that you overcame with other services.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. So it is multi-service doctrine, and it's something that was born out of nuclear posture review, but this took the services a long time to publish. I was fortunate to have followed another great team that wrote the first draft. We also received a lot of really great feedback from the CAD team and staffing, so thanks for that. But ultimately, the Army, Navy, Air Force staffs, along with StratCom and some of the joint staff, tried very hard to get this right in terms of sending the right message about what it is that we were doing. And some of the considerations that were hard to wrap our minds around, it took us a little bit of time to do, was that this superseded doctrine that was published when, the Army had nukes, right, which is not the case now. So there was a lot of ground to cover, and the changes in the last 25 years about what this doctrine was and what it wasn't. So the old doctrine, nuclear operations, was about just that, right? What we think of today as joint nuclear operations, where these are operations to, use nuclear weapons short of employment. So all the things we do with nuclear weapons that don't involve, right, shooting them off. And then also the employment part of it. So that's nuclear operations. This operations in a nuclear environment, the Army led the development of, because as nuclear weapons are used in combat, right, should the US or anybody else decide to use a nuclear option, the people that are going to be the most affected by that are probably going to be Army forces, outside of the civilian population. But those on the ground are going to be the Army forces. So it made sense that, we would lead this with the other services. And that, worked well as we tried to figure out how to get the content right that meshed with all of the service roles in nuclear operation or nuclear modernization, right? So improving and sustaining the nuclear deterrent, how we develop forces to do those things. And then above all else, right, we wanted to make sure that this was consistent with defense policy. So what that came to in what we, had some sticking points about was trying to understand the most important things for service forces. That's not just the Army, but the Navy and the Air Force, to know about when the joint force employs nuclear weapons, right? That's not a trivial thing, not only because our roles are so different and the domains in which we primarily operate are so different, but just because there's a lot of history and a lot of changes that have happened in the Army force and the way we interact with nuclear weapons. And, hey, we were concerned about messaging, right? So this doctrine was written to help service forces prepare, but also to demonstrate that the joint force cares about this problem and is treating it appropriate, right? Treat this problem, like General Garricky said, right? You treat it like it's a condition of LSCO. This is something that the enemy has the capability to do. They said that, they would consider using it, and they practice employing it. So those are three very strong indicators that, we should do our best to prepare our forces to be able to respond to it should the, perhaps unlikely circumstance occur where it is used, and we have to figure out to do afterwards.
Since the Ukraine-Russia war started, mainstream media mentioned the threat of Russia using tactical nukes. So does this relate to how you describe nuclear operations with the levels of war in ATP 372?
So ultimately, nuclear weapons affect all levels of war. They're a deeply emotional place in history, as well as, their prominence in defense policy for every nation, right? Not, to include ones that don't have nuclear weapons, about whether they want to pursue or don't want to pursue attaining that capability. And then they're tremendously powerful, right? More powerful than any conventional munition that we've developed thus far, right? And the allure of these weapons, in General Garricky's a discussion, also in some other podcasts he's done, there's this allure of using these weapons in an operational context. There's a real threat of them using them there because of their ability to overcome stalemate, right? You can use them right now, and they achieve, effects on the battlefield that are very, very hard to mitigate. So on the strategic side, moral outrage, breaking of international norms, things that you see today in response to, not just Russian, but also the PRC and, North Korean threats of nuclear use. Those are things that leaders who would contemplate using nuclear weapons would have to weather should they decide to use one. And those are the cons, right? The things that they don't want to happen. But the outrage that we see now is surely less than what would happen if they used a nuclear weapon, right? So I think about, what happened after the Syrians used chemical weapons, what happened, after we kind of learned about the PRC development of advanced bioweapons after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and threats of nuclear weapons. If a nuclear weapon were used, you would expect the outrage to be more than what you see today. And that's a significant cost for them. So at the strategic level, there's a lot that, that someone deciding whether or not to use nuclear weapons has to consider. Tactical impacts are kind of obvious. In ATP 372, right, we give a great description in Chapter 2 that gives you really layman's terms of what nuclear weapons effects are and how they affect combat power. I don't think we're going to get deep into the science here, but that's a great chapter and it's short. So, it really gives a good description of what we think the tactical leader needs to know. And what's important about this is that all of that stuff that we see in Hollywood, it's not true, right? Those are wildly mythical descriptions of what nuclear weapons are. And if we want our force to be able to operate in this environment, we have to be the instructors. We have to be the educators and the trainers and not let Hollywood do that work for us. So for the Ukraine war in particular, right, this gives a good context for the operational level risks and what might be most consequential for joint leaders. So as General Garricky alluded to, right, Russian has this capability, very low yield use, right? Things that are on the order of several times more powerful, 5-10 times more powerful than our most powerful conventional munitions. They would be difficult to detect. They would be catastrophic on the battlefield if employed in a tactical, at a tactical level to achieve an operational level effect. And that's a real problem to have lots of them, right? These so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons. And they're called non-strategic because the other category we typically talk about are strategic weapons. And those are weapons that we use to wage nuclear war between homelands, right? So if you can shoot it from one homeland to another, it's strategic. If you, typically can't, or that's not its intended purpose, we would call them non-strategic. And there is a wide range of non-strategic nuclear weapon capability that Russia holds, right? Rockets, missiles, mines, hand grenades. Okay, they probably don't have nuclear hand grenades, but if such a thing existed, I bet that they would make a drawer full of them, right? So General Garricky's, analysis of this ability of a nation to use, nuclear weapons in a tactical context to achieve operational objectives, like that is a very real thing that we're seeing in the Ukraine conflict today.
Thanks. I'd also like to talk about the commanders and their staffs. Because Chapter 3, my takeaway from that was that we have a journey ahead of us when it comes to training our units to survive nuclear threats. Whether that's training, planning, how we operate. General Garricky emphasizes this point as increasing our nuclear IQ. So let's listen to what he said in our previous episode.
Really, if you broke down our schedules and looked at what we're working on, we're just not spending enough time thinking and responding to warfighting issues. Just not. The other thing is that we are a very hyper-compliant officer corps. Hyper-compliant. And we do the things we're told to do as appropriate. But we don't get high marks on creativity, and we don't get high marks on initiative. And so our adversaries are taking advantage and will take advantage of us. So our nuclear IQ, part of our nuclear IQ is imagination. Part of our nuclear IQ is education. Part of our nuclear IQ is training.
Gentlemen, could you give the listener some nuggets on how you see commanders and their staffs integrating nuclear ops into planning and training?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of the biggest struggles that we have is when we engage with commanders and staffs of, hey, this nuclear problem training for this is super complex, and it is hard to conceptualize how a command and staff can work through this of training and thinking about the whole problem. As Jason alluded to, Chapter 2 focus on the warfighter, Chapter 3 focus on the commanders and staffs, and I think a lot of our formations are just unfamiliar with this. But what I try to get them to conceptualize is that If we break it down, we can really make this palatable and make it a good training event that's, very, very valuable, and it's not burdensome, and it's not derailing a training event or exercise. And and how we do that is that we think about it as most of our maneuver formations are really, really good at reacting to contact. They're very good at reacting to visual, direct, indirect contact. At the 10 levels, soldiers know what to do. They know their battle drills. If we look at the nuclear effects, the blast and fires from a nuclear weapon, those are effects that are present from conventional munitions. And as Jason just alluded to, yeah, there's a matter of scope and a multitude of difference between. But the threat is really an indirect fire threat. But what I mean is that we're already reacting to indirect fire. In this case, it'd be move out of the area that's on fire and less of, get out of the way of the shrapnel. But the foundation is still there for our young warfighters. The thing that we often forget is that CBRN is actually one of the 8 forms of contact and is really contact with contaminants. That enables our force to do accurate warning and reporting. With nuclear contamination, perhaps present from a use of a munition, sharing some of those mitigation techniques as a chemical contamination, a lot of units are already getting after this. Another thing to think about is that a unique form of contact from nuclear operations, besides the CBRN and perhaps the indirect, is the electronic magnetic threat, which, if we really look at the current CTC rotations modeled after emerging threats from the Ukrainian conflict and their use of cell phones and indirect fires on the electromagnetic spectrum, this isn't so different than localized jamming. Advising a commander and a staff on understanding how they can layer these, individual training focuses into a more consolidated training event, obviously scaled to be enabling, they can achieve many other training objectives that we're getting after, and really be a little bit more catered towards large-scale combat operations and not just focused on, how do we react to artillery, but, putting that all together. Conversely, that's kind of from a red and threat perspective. We can also look at this from a friendly blue side. So looking at, how our planning commanders and staff would want to make the best use of those effects. This is more getting after, echelons above brigade and those warfighter exercises at the corps and above. We can really exploit those effects in the same ways and have staffs look at what does the messaging look like after we do some of these operations, and how do we get after the psychological effects on our forces, and what does all of that look like? And so there's interesting ways that we can work commanders and staffs in such a way to make it very, very valuable training that's getting after a multitude of training objectives that we already touch upon.
Jason, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Shaun said it very well. And a lot of these, leader development, training, education, modification efforts, right? The modernization of the Army to be able to address this threat. That's what Objective 10 Bravo is getting after in a lot of ways. So, Shaun talked about, similar threats and what do you do to be able to respond to those. I typically think about direct and indirect fires, right? What is common about direct and indirect fires that could protect you from, a nuclear attack? Well, we've been digging foxholes for a long time because we know that direct and indirect fires, the effects of them are mitigated by getting into a foxhole. It also mitigates nuclear weapons, right? So we don't have to design a new foxhole specifically because there's a nuclear threat. The things we're already doing, dispersion, right? Discipline in the electromagnetic spectrum, all of those things help to mitigate the threat. The problem, and where it's important for commanders particularly to emphasize the nuclear part of the training, is that we know the foxhole works because we've tested it, because we've trained with it, because we've used it in combat. And until we start doing that same level of training everywhere that we use foxholes for the nuclear threat, we're not going to know if those things that we're doing are sufficient to mitigate the impact of a nuclear attack. We have battle drills for preparing for a nuclear attack. We have battle drills for reacting to a nuclear attack. Are they sufficient? We can model the effects on the battlefield in a CTC rotation, in home station to some degree. If we can't, we need to figure out how we do that to prepare commanders, right, to do this training appropriately and get the right analysis to assess the readiness of their units. But we got to do that across the Army. That is an Army modernization challenge that is all wrapped up inside of 10 Bravo, specifically to enable commanders to be able to build readiness against these threats.
One other thing that I was curious about is we know we're going to fight with allies and partners, but when I was doing the research for this, ATP 372 is at a CUI level. So how are you guys working to level the playing field when it comes to working with our allies and partners regarding nuclear operations?
That's a great question, especially as we know we want to bring our friends to town to be able to fight any large-scale combat operation. What I would say is that we're working with the U.S. Army Seaburn School, and we actually just pushed an unclassified version of ATP 3-72 for publication and release. So it's pending release, and we're working at this, but as you can imagine, we're always working towards interoperability, but classification is challenging when it relates to talking about this. But again, as we try to break, nuclear operations up into bite-sized portions, we have the ability to work on each one of these individual tasks as it relates to react to indirect contact, conduct mitigation measures, conduct intelligence preparation of the operating environment. What I would say is that we have ATP 3-72 and are working our other doctrine across this, but doctrine's not going to do it alone. And some of those other efforts that we're working on perhaps do a better job of setting conditions for interoperability with our partners. So our ability to influence the decisive action training environment, the date that we use across all of our training venues is going to help us be able to bring partners to those combined training center rotations for them to be able to see how we plan and actually, put this to practice, as kind of Jason alluded to, and evaluate our units of how we get after it. We're also looking at ways of working with the Mission Command training program as they move forward into warfighter exercises at the echelons above brigade. And of course, we're always integrating into other training exercises that our partners are at. But, at the end of the day, our partners are imperative in the way that the Army accomplishes large-scale combat operations. And U.S. Army Nuclear and Counterweapons Mass Destruction Agency, we see a lot of our teams deploying regularly to support training out into the force as well. And a lot of the joint exercises that at the combatant command levels and at the theater Army levels, we see much of our partners there at the same training activities that our teams are. So that's a little bit of how we're getting after it, but we've got a lot of work to do. And so some, again, of not just focusing on ATP 3-72, but figuring out where that goes into our other doctrine across the Army of understanding the operating environment is going to be extremely important for us to be able to, really bring our partners and allies up to speed. Thanks,
Shaun. One thing that you mentioned a little earlier was psychological effects, and that comes up in ATP 372 a few times. So I'd like you guys to talk about what expectations should we be forming as, soldiers, leaders, regarding psychological hazards of nuclear operations.
Yeah, the bottom line here is nuclear weapons effects include those that are unlike any produced by any other class of weapons, right? And we're not training our soldiers on what those things are. So radiation exposure, right? It is invisible. It involves numbers that people don't understand what's good and what's bad. And we need to get after that, right? Because ultimately, on the battlefield, what you're gonna expect is for a 20-something-year-old NCO, right, to get up out of a foxhole after a nuclear detonation has gone off, look behind them, and say, "Follow me," right? Maybe with a mushroom cloud in the distance. And if we want any of those soldiers to follow them, then they have to understand what the risks are to them, what is being done to mitigate that risk, and that they can be successful on the battlefield. We have to train our soldiers to understand nukes don't end a fight, that they should expect a fight after a nuclear attack, and that the best path to preserving their lives and accomplishing their mission is to prepare for operations in a nuclear environment.
Yeah, I think Jason really covered this and really, really well. And, I think it comes back to, the resiliency of the first bullets flying and then the reconstitution as well. But it really gets after large scale combat operations in general. Messaging the scale and the scope of this. As an aviator, Lisa, I'm sure that you can relate. What does large scale combat operations look like when we don't have the golden hour to be able to medevac our soldiers, where it just takes too long to get after some of those things? Looking at Israel and Ukraine, we can see glimpses of what large scale combat operations might look like for us, and we can also see that how being trained, resilient, and recognize that the fight is going to go on regardless of the operating environment, especially as a ground force. We're going to have to fight through it. Our mission is going to remain unchanged. We're just going to have to, operating in a different environment than we're used to seeing. And so I think that really changed as, we looked away from counterinsurgency and looked towards large-scale operations. And we've really got to work at this as it relates to training. And, as Jason alluded to, of putting that NCO and training them in such a way that they're resilient and competent and confident enough to be able to deal with the situations that are presented to them. But we've seen this throughout history. It's not something that's insurmountable. There's been shocking battlefield effects across not only U.S. history but just military history. I mean, the first machine gun or cannon or tank or IED, they likely seemed very, very complex and almost impossible to overcome. But at the end of the day, each of those, tools and each of those effects on the battlefield, they're not as scary today as when they were first seen. And, as a force, we've got to be prepared to deal with what large-scale combat operations threats present to us. And we've got to be prepared to, employ our own tools to be able to get after that. So, the enemy tank doesn't overcome us because we've got our own and we know how to use them and are prepared to execute that. So there's a couple different lines to look at as we look at nuclear operations, but it really comes back to that training and being prepared so we can make a resilient force that's credible and able to deal with the large-scale combat operations.
Thanks. You guys have given us a lot to think about. Any other information that you would like our listeners to think about? I mean, you gave us a lot to think about already.
Yeah, what I would have for that is that, Major General retired Garrick, he said it in a couple of his different podcasts, but, nuclear weapons are a powerful battlefield shaper with simultaneous effects at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. They hit every domain and every warfighting function. But many of those effects, they can be mitigated, provided that we, harness the energy, expertise, and the innovation of our leaders, and we have leaders that are, understand this and are well trained. And that really gets after, what he's dubbed as our nuclear IQ, and raising our nuclear IQ across all of our leaders and our soldiers to be able to, get after this, because it's not the most complex and most insurmountable problem that will be presented with in combat. There's perhaps things that have not revealed themselves yet that are going to be much more dangerous and difficult for us to overcome. But we can train, and we can make ourselves resilient, and we can make sure that our leaders focus on this in such a way that if it is presented in the operating environment, that we've got a head up and we're prepared to overcome it. Not just that from a training perspective, but it makes us more ready to be, to serve as a flexible response option, as a flexible deterrent option, and it adds tools for the kit bag at the upper echelons for the administration to be able to rely on us to, maybe stand down a situation that our conventional force is so well prepared that we back a threat adversary down when they look at, hey, we don't want to fight the big dude that's been to the gym. So when we look at it in that perspective, I think that there's ways that we can overcome this, and that's really the message that I would have, is that Yes, this is complex, but there are ways for us to overcome this as a force, and there are ways to break this down in such a way that our leaders can get after this, and at the tactical level and at the operational level of where we're training.
Thanks, gentlemen. And before we close up, Jason, I just want to congratulate you on the days or the hours that you have left wearing this great uniform. I think by the time that this is published, you will be retired. So thank you for your service to our country through all the years.
No, thanks, Lisa. That's fantastic. I appreciate it.
Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, breaking doctrine takes a team. Without the Crew and Special Doctrine Division here at CAD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by Captain Wyatt Harper in 29 Pixel Studios. Please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, or Spotify podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.